Hi, folks. This is Abel James, and thanks so much for listening to the Fat Burning Man Show, where we talk about real food and real results and sometimes terrible puns. Today's very special guest is none other than Mr. Tim Ferriss. So I just got back from speaking at Dave Asprey's Bulletproof Biohacking Conference out in San Francisco, and I couldn't believe how many listeners were there, and thanks so much for coming up to me and saying hi. I always love meeting you guys, and I really couldn't believe how many of you guys made the trip all the way from Australia and all corners of the world. So expect to see a lot more in the biohacking, mental game, brain stuff type realm coming from me in the near future. That's obviously a huge interest of mine, and I think a lot of yours too. So stay tuned. There's lots of fun to come. Now, before we get to the show, I wanted to let you know that if you leave a review for the Fat Burning Man Show on iTunes in the next 48 hours, then one of you guys will win a copy of my book, The Wild Diet. All you have to do is leave a review for the Fat Burning Man Show on iTunes, then sign up for my mailing list at fatburningman.com if you haven't already, and just shoot me an email saying that you left a review. So go for it. Winning free stuff is cool, and I always appreciate your support. Why am I asking you to do this? Because we got #1 in health last year in many countries across the world, and I want to make sure that we hit it this year too. So thanks in advance. All right, so on to the show. Tim Ferriss is a man of many talents, now an excellent cook, as well as a 3-time New York Times best-selling author with, of course, the 4-Hour Workweek, the 4-Hour Body, and now the brand spanking new 4-Hour Chef. I feel like we spent most of this interview laughing and goofing off, but there are lots of truth bombs in there too, so we could have talked all day, but it's a great interview. I know you guys are going to love it. In today's show, we talk about how to become a killer cook as quickly as humanly possible, whether or not Tim stands by his inclusion of beans in the slow-carb diet, what it's like to snort smart drugs to learn Chinese, and how you can trick your friends into eating roasted crickets. All right, let's go hang out with Tim. All right, folks, today I'm stoked to be here with a best-selling author, biohacker, consumer of crickets, and master of time and space, Mr. Tim Ferriss. What's cooking, Tim?
I'm working on the time and space. That's a very squirrely one.
You're getting there, though.
Yeah, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So I had to notice your books are getting heavier and heavier, and I'm legitimately afraid of what your next book might look like. So are you just showing off or what?
I'm trying to make my readers stronger and stronger by making them carry these books around. Ideally, one under each arm. Yeah, 3.78 pounds for the latest. It's up there. But I'm going to end that trend with whatever I do next, whether it's book or short form children's books or who knows. But I'm definitely not going to make my books longer from this point out.
That's good news for everyone. Although it's a killer book. I have to admit I didn't get all the way through it. I think that you even mentioned throughout the book you don't want people to read it in traditional, conventional ways. It's something where you can definitely skip around, and it's not just a book about cooking. It's more about learning, which is totally my bag. So.
Yeah, the books are really as long as they need to be. I actually cut 250 pages from the 4-Hour Chef, believe it or not.
Really?
We're not talking about notes. We're talking about pages, done pages.
Holy smokes!
Because it was as long as it needed to be. But they're all intended to be choose your own adventure books in a way, where people can dip in and dip out. And I think that's really how the mind functions in a nonlinear way. So I try to match that.
Yeah.
In the books.
It is. And when it comes to learning, and you talk about this a lot in your book, you try to model your behavior or your learning style by looking at people who are succeeding who shouldn't be necessarily. And so that's actually one of the ways that I got into this approach to nutrition. I was looking at people who could not exercise for whatever reason, and old people, which led me to, for example, to someone like Mark Sisson, who's a 60-year-old with a six-pack. So what's the secret to crushing it in a particular domain when the odds are against you?
Being Mark Sisson, I think. He's a beast. He's a really good guy.
Yeah, he is.
I think the key to crushing it, doing well, is asking a lot of questions about assumptions and asking a lot of hypothetical questions. And I list out about 20 of the questions that I use routinely in the deconstruction section of the 4-Hour Chef. But in general, they all fall under the category of, what if I did the opposite? So looking at best practices, looking at the most common approaches, looking at the rules and regulations, whatever they are outside of science and the law, they're pretty much negotiable. So, for instance, you mentioned looking at people who couldn't exercise. The way that I learned how to swim, which I couldn't do 3 years ago, was by asking, first identifying the reasons I'd failed before, which came down to using kickboards for practice, which every coach tried to have me do, which I found exhausting and humiliating because I wouldn't move.
Right.
And then secondly, breathing, timing breathing. I just could not learn technique while trying to learn to breathe at the same time. And so I asked, what if I had to learn to swim without kicking? What if I had to learn to swim without breathing? And then started looking at the Paralympics, for instance, as one example. And then ultimately found a method by using those questions to filter my attention and searching called total immersion swimming. And within 10 days went from 2 laps maximum, 1 or 2 laps max, to 20, 30, 40 laps at a time with no stress, no exhaustion at all.
That's killer.
And I wrote a blog post about this, and people printed out the blog post, went to the public pool, and were able to replicate that in an afternoon in some cases.
Yeah, I actually did that.
Awesome. So as you know, progress can come obscenely quickly when you start to question things or do things. What if I did the opposite? Another question would be, what if I did the reverse, for instance? And that can be applied to anything from learning languages to tango to chess. In the case of chess, for instance, there's been an amazing world-class chess player named Josh Waitzkin, who was the basis for Searching with Bobby Fischer, both the book and the movie. And he learned to play chess with his first formal coach in reverse. They didn't start with openers because openers are typically dependent on memorization. They don't teach you principles. They started with the very end game, pawn and king versus pawn. And that allowed him to make tremendous progress. And he later took a very similar approach and applied it to Tai Chi push hands, became national champion, and I think world champion, and most recently became the first black belt under Marcelo Garcia, who's like the Wayne Gretzky, Michael Jordan of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah.
So these blueprints, these recipes are learnable and they're replicable. That's what makes them good. Exactly what makes them good.
Yeah. So to use cooking as an example, like by your own admission, you were a hopeless cook at the beginning, and you were infamous for, I remember this, microwaving eggs on YouTube. But
yeah, in a plastic container. and not just eggs. We're talking liquid egg whites.
Yum.
I mean, it's just like, ugh, how disgusting.
But clearly you've built some skill in the kitchen. So what are some of the top things that my listeners can do to become a killer chef in the shortest possible amount of time?
The very first thing, and again, I asked the same question that I asked myself with swimming. I asked, why have I failed at cooking before? Why have I quit it so many times? And it came down to too much time in many different ways, buying groceries, lots of ingredients, preparation, cooking and cleanup, which is absolutely my least favorite part of the whole process, and I think most people do.
Sure.
Time, cost. So you start a lot of cookbooks, and they say, all right, well, just to get started, you'll want to use this following gear, and it's like $1,200 or $2,000 worth of equipment.
Right.
And so on and so forth. The list went on. So when I was trying to learn to cook, I realized that, number one, you have to deconstruct something like cooking into smaller pieces, just like you have to deconstruct, let's say, learning to speak Spanish into more manageable pieces. And in the case of cooking, it seems like one activity when people phrase it as I want to learn to cook, but it's not. If you've never really cooked before, you find a recipe you love and you want to then make that recipe, you'll typically take an hour to grocery shop, or an hour and a half, because you don't know where anything is. Then you get home, you don't have any knife skills, so it takes you forever to prep, and maybe you have a small kitchen. Then there's the cooking, and then there's the cleanup. And so I broke those all out and considered them separate skills, and then worked on one at a time. So you focus on the actual cooking as opposed to the grocery shopping, the prep, or the cleanup, which means you would, for instance, limit all of your recipes to 4 ingredients or fewer. You would use disposable plates, and you can get recycled bamboo or anything like that if you'd like, wasara plates, and you focus exclusively on very short duration cooking, like making ossobuco, which you can prepare in 5 minutes for 4 to 6 people, and then you just wait for 2 hours and you have this amazing thing in front of you. And by layering it that way, your adherence to the program skyrockets and the abandonment rate plummets. And this is true with everything, right? Like, you want to learn, let's say you want to quit smoking, or you want to help your parents quit smoking and they're over the age of 50. Well, if you're like, hey, I'm going to give you this iPhone app to help you quit smoking, and they've never used an iPhone, that's 2 new behaviors at the minimum. They're going to fail. You have to give them one at a time. So breaking it down. But just to give you a really fun example of using the same framework, because I want to re-emphasize how broadly they apply. What if I did the reverse? Okay, so you hear a lot about getting a steak to room temperature before you cook it, or getting meats to room temperature. They call it tempering in some cases. Always get it to room temperature, always get it to room temperature. Well, turns out that if you do the opposite with, let's say, a ribeye steak, get a ribeye steak that's like an inch and a half thick. To make the perfect steak, here's what you do. You pat it dry, you put it in the freezer for 45 minutes, and you do that not to make it cold, although it'll get cold, to evaporate all of the surface moisture, which turns out being key to getting that beautiful crust on the outside, which is called the Maillard reaction. Then you take it out, you preheat the oven to 200 degrees, so it's very low. You sear the hell out of the steak, meaning you just basically burn each side for like 60 seconds, and then the edges if you want to get fancy. Then you put it on a bed of rosemary. Just like pick it up with tongs, throw a bunch of rosemary underneath, and put it back down so it doesn't continue cooking on the pan.
Right.
Put some ghee on top so it melts, and then throw it in the oven. And if you want to get really precise, get a probe thermometer. This is super key. You'll never overcook or undercook anything again. And when that steak hits 130, you just stick the probe thermometer in there and set an alarm for 130. You pull it out. It's probably 20 minutes later, and it will be the best steak you've ever had in your life. And you just spoon a bunch of that rosemary infused ghee, beef fat wonderfulness, and it's absolutely mind-blowing how good it is. But the way you get to that is by starting by doing exactly the opposite of what every cookbook tells you to do.
Right. I'm salivating. Thanks for that.
Yeah, it's so good. It's insane.
Yeah, I haven't actually tried that before, but I'm going to have to. That sounds killer.
Yeah, it's really incredible, and it's so easy. And what I encourage people to do, for instance, is look at the tools that chefs use for multi-purpose tools that home cooks neglect. And so I created a list of these things because I traveled around the world interviewing all these people and spending time in professional kitchens. For instance, professional chefs do not use pot holders. They use lint-free, well, in some cases, lint-free surgical huck towels. They're not even for cooking. They're made for hospitals. They're those blue towels that you see, the hand towels.
Right.
You can use those for everything. You can use them for quickly cleaning stuff, better than using dish rag or a sponge in many cases. You can use it for holding hot pots and whatnot. You can use it for drying things. And they're about $1 a piece on Amazon. They're so cheap. That would be one example. Another example would be something called the Star Peeler, which is this also sold as a Kunri-Kon peeler. They're super cheap. You can get 3 of them for like $10.
Wow.
And you can flip one of those over. So just turn it upside down and then sort of shave off, let's say, the end of a zucchini on the peeler, and it turns into a mandolin. So if you wanted to make like paper thin slices of zucchini that would take an hour to do with a knife, you can do it in 5 minutes just by flipping one of these things upside down. And you also save $30 or $50 or even $100 on a mandolin. You don't have to buy one.
Right.
And you conserve all the space, so you're not making a mess of your kitchen. So those would be a few examples. And I would say that those are also a reflection of applying the 80-20 principle, which you can certainly apply to nutrition and exercise. You can definitely apply to business and finance or even investing, to the world of cooking. So what are the 20% of tools that get you 80% or more of the results that you want, 80% or more of the versatility that you want? You can ask a professional cook this, and if they're really at the top of their game, they'll have answers for that. They'll be like, okay, cool. You want a microplane? You want a tasting spoon? You can actually use that to replace your tongs and all that stuff. maybe you want a Peltex, which is a slotted fish spatula, and a handful of other things. Like, yeah, you're done. Get a cast iron skillet. You can make just about anything you want to make.
Yeah, it's amazing what you can do with a cast iron skillet.
Yeah, I mean, you could spend you could spend less than $50 and be ready to rock and roll. You do not need a whole set of pots and pans. And I get really stressed out by clutter, so
Right.
it's been awesome for me to actually be able to remove almost everything from my kitchen. When I went to India, to Kolkata, I visited a restaurant in the Oberoi Grand Hotel. And the restaurant was the best Thai restaurant, the best reviewed Thai restaurant in all of India, which is a huge deal. There's
Wow.
tons of Thai restaurants there.
Yeah.
And the executive chef used 2 stainless steel skillets and a Victorinox chef's knife that you could buy at Walmart for like $15. That was it. Like, that was
Jeez.
and that, I mean, talk about minimal effective dose. So it's just been awesome to see how something that I viewed as extremely complicated, inconvenient, and generally a pain in the ass. I mean, the way I looked at it was, I work as hard as I do to make money so that I can eat out, so that I don't have to deal with all this. And now, just like with swimming, I used to be deathly afraid of it and avoid it. Now I swim to relax, and now I cook to relax. I mean, it's weird to even hear myself say it.
That's definitely a success, though, when you turn a weakness into not even a strength, but something that you do to relax.
Yeah, like knife skills. I mean, who would have thought that knife skills I find like super meditative now? It's so crazy. I'll just sit there like chopping vegetables and watching, episode of Game of Thrones or something. Find this like moving meditation, whereas before, the knife my mom had given me at college graduation just sat in the block for 15 years as a piece of furniture, because I tried to use it once, was afraid I was going to cut off my fingers, put it back, and never touched it.
And now you're a master.
No, well, my knife skills are pretty good. Yeah. I can teach someone to be comfortable with a knife in about 45 minutes. I mean, it's obviously all outlined in the book, but it's just another one of those things where it's like assumed knowledge. It's like, okay, great, you're a new cook. First thing you should do, dice 5 onions. Like, are you kidding me? Pardon my French. That's the best way to make people never, ever want to touch a knife again, is to like freak them out. So like you start with no stakes practice. For instance, you can buy a lettuce knife, which is the same shape as a chef's knife, so you can learn the proper hand grip and everything. And you could practice when you're not making a meal. The worst time to learn how to use a knife is when you're under pressure to create a meal.
Right.
Whether you're just tired or you're making it for family or something like that. So you get lettuce knife, you buy a couple of stalks of celery, and just practice the motion. Get used to the cutting. Do it in front of the TV. You're not going to cut yourself. You're not going to hurt yourself. And then once you're really comfortable doing that, now no stress. You can jump right into using a knife for actual meals.
Yeah. And I love that approach too. And so few people do it with anything from cooking to anything else. It's just like, instead of making the beginning suck, you make it awesome, or at least like non-threatening and kind of fun.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like, okay, you want to learn how to use, let's say, flip food in a skillet. They always show that on Food Network, right?
Yeah.
So you have a bunch of food in a skillet and you flip it and it lands back in the skillet. If you try to do that for the first time with like hot pasta and it splatters everywhere, you're going to hate yourself. You're going to have to clean the oven. And guess what? You quit, right? Of course you do. That's a hassle. Instead, what you can do is like kneel on a carpet. Carpet part is important. With a skillet full of dry beans, and just practice the wrist motion with dry beans. And then if they fall, big deal. They just land on the carpet, you put them back in. And you can just practice that for 10 minutes, a couple times, and you're good to go. Now you can do it over the stove.
I love that. So speaking of beans, you probably know that you catch a lot of flack in the paleo community for your inclusion of legumes in the slow carb diet. So do you stand by your beans?
Sacrilege. I do stand by the beans. I think that it's, number one, I'm a meticulous tracker, right? I mean, I do routine blood tests on a level of granularity that is hard to believe.
Yeah.
And not to say that science has identified all the important things to track, nor can they track reliably a lot of different things like perambulatory insulin levels. That's tricky, right? Okay. Right. But the point being, I've eaten beans for a long time, lentils, etc., and it does not appear to have any deleterious effect on my health, as long as I am either or I should say both, typically soaking or not generally sprouting, soaking and then cooking properly
Right.
these different items. And you can use things like baking soda or whatever to reduce some of the gaseous effects and so on. But the point being, I think that there's a misconception that, number one, I eat like a can of beans at every meal, which I don't do.
Yeah.
But number two, there's a misunderstanding where I think it's important to underscore for some purists that the good program or excellent program that you follow is better than the perfect program that you quit.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's like you might take someone and, let's say, conclude that, you know what, you want to increase these following performance metrics. I think you're best suited to Tabata protocol. Okay, great. So your first workout, we're gonna put you on a treadmill at an incline and have you do 20-second sprints with 10 seconds of rest. And like 90% of the people you put through that, if they're not prepared for it, are not going to come in for a second workout.
Yeah, it's designed to be brutal.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I was first training people in college, just friends of mine, because I was competing as in kickboxing and various things at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in really serious training. And so my buddies would be like, hey, yeah, I just want to get in good shape. What should I do? And I'd be like, all right, well, you need to do large compound movements, number one. Number two, training to failure is extremely effective if you want to keep the time minimal. So let's do trap bar like high rep trap bar deadlifts to failure. And nobody came back for a second workout.
Yeah.
Nobody. And I'm like, wow, these people are just lazy. And it's like, well, no, you're just weird because you're in like the 1% who loves to do masochistic training and will take the time and see it as an investment. But most people have other things they want to focus on. And so, for instance, the slow carb diet, I think is, number one, I think it is actually good on its own. But secondly, it's the perfect dress rehearsal for paleo. And in fact, a lot of people go from slow carb to stricter paleo.
Yeah, definitely.
But for me, when I'm traveling, like if I land in Denver airport and I need to eat a meal, am I going to eat slow carb or paleo? I'm going to eat slow carb, because if I'm going to have like a chicken breast with leafy vegetables, I'm not going to get the calories I need.
Right.
And I think there's not letting the perfect be the enemy of good is very important when you're looking at behavioral change. So I do get a lot of flack for the beans. Yes, I know about phytic acid and all this stuff. I do, but I think that there's a big difference between eating a lot of raw legumes and eating properly soaked and cooked legumes.
Right.
And there's a pretty good historical record to, I think, support that. But yes, I'm very well aware of the flack that I get. But if you look at, for instance, one of the recent blog posts I put up, we tracked 3,500 people who were attempting the slow carb diet. We had an 82% success rate.
Wow.
Which is absurd.
Yeah, that's killer.
The numbers are crazy. And the fat loss average, although averages can be very misleading, we can talk about that, but the average was, I think, either somewhere between 8.2 and 8.6 pounds over that 4-week period. But there's something like 14 or 15% who lost dramatically more than that. And there were quite a few who lost 20, 30 pounds in that given month. Yeah,
that's awesome.
And most importantly, though, the most important, because you could get potentially similar results with something like calorie counting, right? Or I shouldn't say, there's calorie counting has a place for performance, I think. We can talk about that too. But for starvation diets, then you'll see the rebound where people regain fat and they end up skinny fat.
Right.
With the slow carb diet, at the same time, I like to highlight people who have been either on it for multiple years or who have lost their desired weight and then kept it off by following some even less strict version of the slow carb diet, which is pretty lenient to start with. So the compliance and adherence is how I measure the success first and foremost.
Yeah, that's definitely a great way to measure it, I would say, beans or not.
Yeah, and I mean, there are multiple examples. One of people who've lost well over 100 pounds and been able, in some instances, to completely remove dependence on injectable insulin, which is pretty amazing. So it's been wild, but I definitely view myself as a student of behavioral modification first and biochemistry second.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to actually make this achievable for people, right? And that's kind of the difficult thing about bridging that gap, because you may know what's 100% perfect, but can you even do that yourself? I know I can't, and I assume like pretty much no one can, at least not for a lifetime.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's learning how to persuade and teach is just as important as what you teach. And I think that's critically important for people to know, whether they're involved in, whether they're a CEO closing deals, whether they're someone working within a company who has to sell their ideas or negotiate a raise, or someone who wants to catalyze change in their viewers, readers, users, fill in the blank.
Yeah.
So it's been really fascinating to watch. I mean, one example was that I thought was really hysterical. I have a friend who's pretty strict paleo, and he's never been able to get his mom to follow any of it. And he's tried multiple times. And she saw me on Dr. Oz at one point and came back, bought the 4 Hour Body, and she called her son and was like, I saw Dr. Oz the other day, and this nice young man, Tim Ferriss, was on there, and he talked about this, this, and this, and it made so much sense. So I'm starting this diet. And he's like, Mom, I've been telling you the same thing for a decade. And it was, in fact, the same thing, but it was communicated slightly differently. There was more of an allowance made for human nature.
Yeah.
And meaning the cheat day, for instance.
Sure.
And it makes a difference.
Yeah. That a similar thing actually happened with my family, and family can be the hardest. Often it is. Like, you don't really convince your family to do anything. They have to come to that independent conclusion and think that it wasn't your idea in the first place. But yeah, it took my I actually had my mom on the show a while back, and she had to see Dr. William Davis on TV and listen to my interview with him before she realized that wheat might not be that great of a thing. And I'm like, Mom, I've been doing this for years. Come on. But it's so funny how that works.
Yeah. I think parents in particular are challenging because they're like, you're just a kid, how much of an expert you might think yourself to be. But that's the name of the game, right?
Yeah, totally.
You have to be able to solve for the extremes. The mean takes care of itself.
Right. And speaking of being a kid, I understand you have a penchant for eating crickets. Is that right?
Yeah, I grew up. I ate everything, and as a little kid, ate crickets. And
that's awesome.
Only for this book, decided to revisit insects as a source of protein. So I played around with the muscle cricket protein bar, which is actually really delicious. But the roasted crickets taste a lot like if you could take, let's say, dried soybeans or like edamame. And then make them, give them a hazelnut type of flavor. That's basically what you're looking at. It's like a crunchy hazelnut, a nutty type of flavor. And you can make some great stuff out of it. It's you can also, if you want to play a prank on your friends, and this is, I guess, me showing how infantile I am, but you can take the roasted crickets and grind them together with, let's say, salt. So you just put them into like a salt grinder and grind it together and tell them it's some kind of fancy spiced salt. And then you can tell them later that they're having cricket salt. But they'll never object. It's tasty stuff.
I've got to try that. The practical joke piece, at least.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So since I have you here, Tim, let's shift gears a little bit. I just got back from speaking at a biohacking conference out in San Francisco, and I was doing squats hooked up to firing electrodes and squealing like a little girl the whole time. So what do you think about upgrades to efficiency and training the central nervous system? Have you gotten into that much?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the central nervous system is a mediator of most sports performance, certainly. I mean, whether we're looking at peak power output or ultra endurance, I think that there are definitely applications. And, in fact, from pretty good sources, it has been rumored that some Jamaican sprinters we may know that shall not be named use a neural modification for more efficient fast twitch muscle contraction.
Yep.
Namely, acetylcholinesterase inhibitors like huperzine A, although they may use, I don't know the specifics, galantamine or something like that, to increase the intersynaptic acetylcholine, which facilitates muscular contraction.
Right.
And I think there's a lot to be said for it. I haven't toyed around with it as much as I used to because I actually feel like I would prefer to let other guinea pigs fuss around with their nervous systems before I jump into the fray.
Right.
And the neurological modification, I think, is in some cases playing with a pretty sensitive instrument. So you have to approach it very intelligently. I would, and this is probably a very controversial thing to say, I don't know, but that using therapeutic doses of, let's say, injectable testosterone, I would view as a known quantity. There's 50 to 60 years of literature that you can review, and at least you know what side effects in most cases you're signing up for. But with a lot of the neurological stuff, I'm game for it. I'm just happy to watch other people experiment for a bit longer, because I don't have any particular performance goals or competitions that I'm training for right now.
Yeah.
If I had some big public competition in 4 to 8 weeks, it might be a different story.
Right. Yeah, I can definitely see you signing up for something like that.
Yeah.
It was definitely a very interesting sensation. There's nothing like it that I've ever experienced when your muscles are firing and you're not doing it.
It's extremely uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Some of the old, if you might remember, these ab belts did the same thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Bruce Lee even used these at one point, where it was basically a TENS unit that would spark contraction in the abdominal muscles, and it's an extremely uncomfortable feeling. You feel like your body's trying to vomit. It's really really unpleasant.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. Your body is trying to vomit.
Yeah, and what I'm really curious about with the direct current stimulation, or even I've been looking very closely at certain aspects of improving mental performance using electrical current, like transcranial direct stimulation.
Sure.
And things of this type, which are pretty incredible. They're funding some studies, in fact, related to some of that stuff. But one of the questions I have is that if you're applying current to muscular contraction and your leg is in a fixed position, for instance, you're not getting, it wouldn't appear, the proper overlap of filaments to cause the change to the cross bridging and whatnot that would provide you a strength over a full range of motion.
Right.
So that's the kind of stuff that I'm super curious about, because I did experiment not all too long ago with transfer of strength from partial range of movement to full range of movement.
Okay.
And it appears that unless you are performing the exercise in your weakest range of movement, from a muscular standpoint, the strength doesn't transfer. You may certainly elicit certain changes in tendons and ligament adaptation, but those are some of the questions that I'd love to see explored.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely something to watch, but you might not want to strap on those electrodes quite yet.
Yeah, I'll let the youngins jump into that. But I'm certainly happy to watch the results.
Yeah, but I know you are a fan, obviously, of self-experimentation. I know you dabbled in neuroscience at Princeton. I did brain science at Dartmouth, so I totally geek out on a lot of the same stuff. And so you spent some time like snorting smart drugs, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, vasopressin in this particular case. Well, synthetic vasopressin, which is desmopressin. The application there was using an antidiuretic hormone, vasopressin, which is typically prescribed to adolescents who still bedwet, for instance, which was not my problem, actually.
It'll be our little secret.
Right, exactly. Vasopressin is a fascinating hormone, and when one drinks way too much, for instance, two things happen. First, you piss like a racehorse.
Yeah.
Secondly, you forget things. You time travel. You lose your memory. Both of those are related to inhibition of vasopressin in the brain by alcohol. So if you do the reverse, if you take a nasal inhalation of desmopressin, two things happen. You don't have to pee as much, and you improve your short-term memory. So I would take hits of this stuff, 2 in each nostril, before Chinese character quizzes. And I could literally arrive 10 minutes before the quiz, flip through the pages almost as quickly as I could turn them after vasopressin, and score 95 to 100%. It was really unreal. As you would imagine, not a good long-term strategy.
Right.
Like your body, the body's pretty fond of homeostasis, and there are a lot of feedback mechanisms, therefore, keep things in check. And if you use something like that routinely, and this is part of the reason why I have a lot of reservations related to, for instance, modafinil or Provigil.
Yeah.
If you use something like that routinely, just as if you were injecting exogenous testosterone, your body's going to change how it produces those things. It's
Right.
going to stop or decrease its own production. Then you can deal with issues of withdrawal or secondary side effects related to regulatory mechanisms like
Right.
the hypothalamus, right? So you have to be careful with this stuff. But in moderation, that's what I played around with, and then only after that point, and I tried everything else too. I mean, oxiracetam, aniracetam, phenylpiracetam, hydrogen, you name it.
Yeah. What do you think about the racetams?
I honestly didn't find the racetams to do much unless I combined phenylpiracetam with choline, a pretty hefty dose of choline, which makes sense. And but phenylpiracetam is, at least if you believe some of the literature, 20 to 30 times more stimulatory than the granddaddy piracetam. But that's really the only racetam that I've found remotely interesting. The hydrogen I've found to have much more interesting effects, and as an over-the-counter option, the combination of forskolin and artichoke extract is actually quite fascinating.
Interesting.
Effects on cyclical AMP and other things. The problem with that combination is it's super, super awesome, and then you need to sleep 13 hours.
Yeah.
So
Oops.
Something's going on there, clearly.
Right.
And the way I looked at it was you have a dose side effect correlation. So the higher the higher the effect, the more side effects there will be. In many ways, a self-contained biological system. Therefore, if I have to sleep for 13 hours, I'm depleting something and I'm not quite sure what the hell it is.
Right.
Or I'm depleting something and I'm clearly not going to be regenerating it quickly enough. So I should use this on a break glass in case of emergency basis only.
Yeah.
Which is what I've ended up doing.
So you still kind of like dabble in these, but you definitely don't make them part of your habits?
That's right. So I might dabble before I have, let's say, a really full day of any type of interactions or media appearances or speaking gigs, things of that type. But I really don't use them on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely almost like a pre-workout product for me. And in fact, I could see many instances where those would certainly accelerate physical process tremendously. Coming back to the question you had about sort of neural modification and central nervous system. Absolutely. I mean, like, yeah, you want to feel good before a workout? Like, try tyrosine, I mean,
yeah.
Like tyrosine and a couple of other goodies, you'll be off to the races.
Totally. And it's amazing how much overlap. I was surprised when I started dabbling in smart drugs a little bit, how much overlap there is with like the bodybuilding community.
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely.
They're like totally into that stuff.
One of the differences is the smart drug folks, not always, although you would hope, given that that the name or the word smart is in the
Could be a misnomer though.
They can be very meticulous with their tracking. So some of the forums are very, very interesting. And when I looked at resveratrol, for instance, for the 4 Hour Body, I spent a lot of time on the Immortality Institute forums looking at different dosages and reported side effects and so forth and so on, trans resveratrol specifically. So that's one of the benefits, I think, of that particular cohort. Is they tend to be, not always, but they tend to be better educated than the bodybuilding crowd.
Yeah.
Their reporting, the self-reporting tends to be, not always, quite good. Of course, you have, just like in the bodybuilding forums, you have like 12-year-olds on keyboards who all bench press 500 pounds.
Yeah.
Like, postulating. You do get plenty of that on the smart drug forums. But
sure.
On average, you tend to get better data, I think.
Yeah. Now, what's your take on, this is definitely growing in popularity lately, the subject of intermittent fasting?
Yeah, intermittent fasting is fascinating. I mean, I've looked at intermittent fasting. I've looked at protein cycling, which is actually more interesting to me.
Yeah.
In a lot of respects. It depends on what you're doing it for. I think that it can be effective for fat loss, certainly. You can preserve lean muscle mass, but it can be problematic for a very high percentage of people who attempt intermittent fasting. Having a focus on behavioral modification, if I am trying to help someone with intermittent fasting, this is all just friends of mine because I don't do any coaching or anything like that.
Yeah.
I will encourage them to have, for instance, even like 8 to 12 grams of branched chain amino acids to help curb some of the carbohydrate cravings and grumpiness, especially if I have to deal with them. I will recommend.
So it's all self-interest.
It's partially self-interest, but also so they're not getting fired from their jobs for being grumpy.
Yeah.
The one caveat I would make is, and I'm not going to name names, but some of the most famous proponents of intermittent fasting would appear to use very high doses of stimulants and anabolics like dianabol, which act as appetite suppressants. That, to me, would greatly color some of the recommendations. I do like intermittent fasting, but I do it when I feel like following a different diet is going to be too inconvenient. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
With intermittent fasting, in many cases, you can consume you can consume worse food even in higher quantities and mitigate a lot of the damage.
Right. I take advantage of that from time to time.
Yeah. I do use intermittent fasting on occasion, but it's not something that I personally rely on all too much.
And how do you do it?
Just the 16-8 kind of. I mean, same. I keep it super simple. I have so much other stuff going on, which I'm grateful for. I'm involved with a lot of exciting projects, but I don't do biohacking full time or anything like that. So I really try to keep things as simple as possible so that I can preserve my decision making, things that are higher leverage. Like I should never have to decide what am I going to have for breakfast today.
Yeah.
That is depleting a finite resource, which is sort of my decision allotment for the day. And there's some pretty good research to support this concept of like ego depletion, where your ability to decision make is finite.
Yeah.
If you waste it on the small stuff, you make poor decisions when it comes to the big stuff.
I like that. I think I could use a little bit of self-modification in that area for sure.
I love routine, man. I'm a big fan.
Yeah. So what is a day in the life like then, in that regard anyway?
Yeah, it's, well, dietarily speaking, I'll just give a quick kind of overview, I suppose. My preferred routine would look something like this. Wake up, have 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of waking up. So I'll have protein first thing off the bat. Most recently, I've been using a blend of whey protein isolate and micellar casein, but there are 1,000,001 ways to do it.
Yeah.
As I brew tea, I will meditate for just 4 to 5 minutes, even less, with one track of music, which is my kind of state cue.
Yeah.
Then I'll get up, I'll have pu'er tea, which is black tea, and you can brew it at much higher temperatures, but it provides a bit of caffeine. And I listen to music and do some type of non-computer based work or non-internet based work for a period of, let's say, an hour or so. Then I'll have a small breakfast. Typically eggs, lentils, spinach would be my ideal. Continue to do work on some type of project for 1 to 2 hours. Ideally then have a kettlebell workout, usually focused on something very fundamental like a two-handed swing. Then go to lunch. Okay, great. Lunch is pretty straightforward. It might be, organic beef with pinto beans and extra side of guacamole and steamed vegetables at a Mexican place, let's say.
Sounds awesome.
Oh, it's great. And then continue doing whatever the hell I'm doing. Have a small dinner, say around 6 o'clock. Then I like to train in the evenings. And this has nothing to do with carb backloading or anything like that, but I like to train in the evenings, typically between like 7 and 11 p.m.
Really? Wow.
Where I find I have the highest pain tolerance, and that's actually pretty consistent based on your sleep cycles. Then I'll have a second meal after working out, and then bedtime, and rinse and repeat.
Cool. So what does your meditation look like? I just started doing that myself as a New Year's resolution, which has actually been working so far. But what does it look like? What are you doing for 4 to 5 minutes?
Yeah, for me, I've tried, I think like a lot of people, to meditate, and I've always quit, right? So I again looked at the reasons, and the reasons were too damn long. Number one. And someone might say, well, if you don't have 30 minutes to meditate, you need to meditate for 3 hours, right? But I disagree with that. I think that that's a very glib fortune cookie way of dismissing a common problem.
I agree.
People are busy, and you don't need 30 minutes of meditation to benefit from it. And that's when I started doing it consistently. is listening to one music song. This was recommended to me by a friend.
Mm-hmm.
Not sitting in lotus position or trying to sit cross-legged with a straight back in the middle of the floor, but actually sitting on top of a cushion with my back against a wall and breathing in very deeply. And this is going to sound kind of woo-woo, new age, but whatever. We're talking about meditation, so fine. Like I view myself as breathing in this like, vibrant green air and expelling this sort of gray air, which is just stress or any anxiety that I encounter during the day.
I like that.
And there are two things I do. Two things. One is with each inhale, I think about something that I'm grateful for, whether that's my girlfriend or really close friends, my family, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then about halfway through the song, I shift to just saying, everything you have everything that you need, and you have plenty of time. Like for everything that's important, you have plenty of time. You can't do everything, but for all the important stuff, you have plenty of time. And I just kind of repeat that over and over again.
Yeah.
And then the song's over and I'm done. That's it.
I'm going to copy that tomorrow.
Yeah. Try it out, man. And here's what one real breakthrough for me with this kind of stuff came about when I read at one point that the benefit or the success of meditation should not be gauged by your ability to control your thoughts when you're meditating. So even if you bounce all over the place when you're trying to do this, or let's say you're trying to think of what you're grateful for and then like something in your inbox comes into your head, don't stress about it. Don't worry about it, because that's not where you see whether you've succeeded or failed. Where you see how you feel for the rest of the day and behave for the rest of the day is how you determine if you've succeeded or failed.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
And that really helped me, because I'm all over the place. I mean, I do the meditation. Some days are better than others, but every once in a while, it's like, man, stuff just keeps on popping into my head, things I need to do, things I can't forget, whatever. And it's like, just chill out. It's one song. If it comes up, fine. You don't have to worry about trying to bat it away. Just kind of let it come up and then float away.
Right.
And I found that if I do it consistently, man, my experience through the entire day is completely different. I'm just entirely different mindset.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It's a wonderful thing to work into your habits. I know we're coming up on time, but I did want to talk about, you touched on something really important in the book, that the next few years will decide the future of food production in the United States and arguably the world. So why is this such a critical time, and what can we do to improve the situation?
Yeah, this is the meta goal, sort of the overarching goal of the 4-Hour Chef, which is, as you mentioned, I mean, it's a book about how to learn anything faster by emulating the world's fastest users, or learners rather. Part of the reason I focused on food is because about 50% of the nation's independent farmers are coming up upon retirement in the next 5 to 10 years, and when that happens, the land will be up for grabs to be used for any number of different purposes. Strip malls and development, industrial ag companies like Monsanto, or independently run smaller producers. And to have the last option manifest in reality, people need to become closer to their food. And an easy way to do that is to just play around with cooking for 2 weeks, and to recognize that buying food from many smaller producers is the only way to defeat buying everything from 2 or 3 huge industrial producers.
Yeah.
And that has to be driven by consumer demand, dollars out of the wallet into a cash register somewhere, obviously virtually or physically.
Yep.
And that's it. I mean, part of the mission with the 4-Hour Chef is to get people to play around with food. And even if they don't ever make a single dish in the book, which you don't have to. I mean, there's plenty in there for non-cooks. It's really a book for non-cooks.
Yeah.
Changing your awareness of food so that you're like, oh, okay, let me ask an extra 2 or 3 questions at the restaurant and make the right choice. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's it. That's it. And what the great news is, if you eat for health, including fertility, mental performance, physical performance, you're going to, by default, buy food from the smaller producers.
Yeah, you have to.
Yeah, like the environmental, economic arguments, fine, whatever. Like, they're there. But just eat for optimal health and optimal fertility, especially. and you will almost always end up buying from the smaller producers.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Tim, where can folks find you?
Best place to find me is 4hourblog.com, FOURHOURBLOG.com. You can also get tons of stuff. I mean, hundreds of pages of free stuff, free videos, etc. from the 4-Hour Chef at 4hourchef.com. And those are probably the two best places to find me. I'd say on Twitter, Ferriss, TFERRISS. And Facebook also at Facebook/Tim Ferriss.
Well, you're everywhere. You're definitely not a hard man to find these days, Tim. So congrats on all your success. Really appreciate your work. And thanks so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
If you'd like to hear more from Tim, and who wouldn't, the name of his new book is The 4-Hour Chef, and it's available anywhere books are sold. And once again, if you leave a review for the Fat Burning Man Show on iTunes in the next 48 hours, you could win a copy of my book, The Wild Diet. So all you have to do is go ahead and leave a review on iTunes for the Fat Burning Man Show, then go sign up for my list at fatburningman.com. If you haven't already, shoot me a note saying you left a review, and you could win a free copy of my book. So thanks in advance. And next week, we have Dr. Lauren Cordain, one of the first major researchers in the area of paleo, and of course, the author of the bestseller, The Paleo Diet. So stay tuned, have a great week, and be well. I'll be talking to you guys soon. Cheers.